but find peace that calms my fears. Jesus, you are my hope and guide. No love compares to yours, so wide. I surrender all my life into your hands. You are faithful forever.
Good evening, everybody. Sexual abuse in our churches is at epidemic levels. Next interview is very personal for me. I met Chelsea Freeman, the author of Redemption, right in the thick of going through a very difficult situation with our own church. And the research we had done showed us that pedophiles, specifically men who abuse minors, have a very, very low rate of true repentance. Her goal with this book is to draw attention to a problem within our churches and also to give victims hope. Chelsea's a survivor. At the end of the video, we're going to leave a website and a contact information for Chelsea, as well as a link to order her book, Redemption. We hope you enjoy the interview. Have a good day. This book just came out in August. And her book is a true story about her childhood abuse. There's actually a pretty unique backstory to how we met. And so I'm just going to share that first, and then we'll get right into the book. So Chelsea's story really hit me personally because her book involves events that happened at several Central Ohio Churches of Christ, and we were involved in those circles. There's several different groups of Churches of Christ. We were involved in the non-instrumental, non-institutional, what they call the hard line. It was actually a lot of the abuse that we saw that ultimately led us to start questioning and going into the teachings. And so that's when the unraveling began for us. So during the time that we were with the Churches of Christ, we were involved in helping 2 different domestic abuse victims. And we discovered from hearing stories from different people that that abusers were just getting passed from congregation to congregation and never really being dealt with. And so it was right in the thick of discovering all of this, and it was really, really weighing heavy on me. And so I actually received an anonymous tip from someone that there was a man at one of our local congregations that was a convicted pedophile. And by that time, because of what we had already been through, I had become pretty good at scouring public files. And so all I had to go on was a last name. I didn't even have his first name. And so ultimately, I found his case file, and that's ultimately how I found Chelsea. And so I found her on Facebook, and I remember the day that I messaged you, I was petrified because I'm like, there's no good way to open this conversation. But because of what we had gone through, I really felt a need to talk to this woman. And I didn't know anything about the book at this point. I just knew that this woman's father was out there. And so I sent her a message. And I just remember that day. So Chelsea, if you want to maybe just comment on what it was like to get that initial message from me. I was so nervous to send it.
Well, getting it. So first of all, I'm glad that we connected after we talked for a little bit. Then I was glad that you reached out to me. When I first got your message, I'm like, what the heck is going on? I'm getting ready to release a book. I hadn't talked to anybody from the Church of Christ since I was 15. So it was like, I'd kind of shut that part of my life off. And then you were like, you said my dad's name, and you knew the year he was convicted. I'm like, how do you know all this stuff about me? So after, I think we messaged on Facebook for a while, I did some creeping on you before I agreed to talk to you on the phone. And then I was kind of like, God, where do you want this? Like, why are you why are you sending this person to me right now? Like, why is she reaching out? And so then I just kind of was like, okay, if there's no huge red flags of why I shouldn't talk to her, then why not talk to her? So
Yeah.
I was scared, but I was like, well, let's try it.
Yeah. I remember that initial phone conversation we had was probably a good hour, and just sharing stories um
And kind of, I had been part of the Church of Christ for a long time. So as you were talking, more stuff came back to me. Like, that's
yeah.
the lingo that they use.
Yeah.
That's terms that they use. That's stuff that and people's names that I hadn't heard of for years.
hmm
You were saying, and I was like, I don't want this to take me back here. Like, I'm
Yeah.
free from this.
So in chapter 1 of your book, you mentioned that your dad drank a lot, and you mentioned a lot of physical abuse. But then you mentioned that it seemed like when your dad found church, he gave up alcohol and replaced alcohol with church. And about 6 months ago, we did a 2-part interview with a gentleman that had really, his dad was a convicted pedophile. He's in prison, and he had done a lot of research on the science behind it. And one of the things that is common knowledge within medical circles is these type of predator type personalities seem to be attracted to positions of power. They seem to be attracted to the ultra conservative church circles where there are very strict rules. So just talk a little bit about, because you mentioned that your dad, you would host Bible studies and things like that.
So yeah, my dad drank a lot when I was younger. I remember going to bars with my mom to pick him up, or him being passed out on the bathroom floor like over Christmas. But I don't remember exactly when he got saved. But I do know that like our lifestyle changed. We didn't hang out with the same people. We didn't do the same things. Like, I was I was going to go to public school. We were homeschooled then.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of different stuff. But since my book has came out, I've had conversations with family and different friends that have been like, your dad was always controlling. Like, your dad controlled your mom before she even graduated or when she did graduate. And so I don't know if we ever looked at different churches to go to, but I do know that like when we started going there, he changed a lot. And I do think like he used alcohol and then he used control. And I think those were, I don't know if they were addictions or power to him, but he was all about looking good and all about maintaining that image. Like that was important to him. We had to act just right. We had to do all the right things. And but I really think that ultra conservative churches are like breeding grounds for that type of stuff, because it is all about rules, and you can control people through rules and that type of stuff. Do I think my dad had a family and was like, I'm going to abuse them? Like, no. Like, I don't think, after years of forgiveness, like, I think that like there's a Casting Crown song called Slow Fade, and I think
I love that song.
More about, it's a slow fade where Satan can get into these ultra conservative churches because there is more control there and there is more rules, and then he gets these guys that have addictions to power or want the control, and then he
kind of uses that,
is able to feed them the lies and uses that to control people.
Yeah.
Going back to the question about abusive men, like, I think that a lot of abusive men are in Church of Christ, but they're everywhere. They are.
It's fine.
Sexual abuse and any abuse isn't about sex. It's about power and control. And I think that when you have any place where there's a lot of rules and expectations, like, that's going to be breeding grounds for that.
Yeah, and one of the things I think I don't remember if I said it at the very beginning, so just in case I'll mention it now. We understand that we're not picking on the churches of Christ. It just happens to be the circles that we were in. But sexual abuse is everywhere.
And if you think about it, Satan is going to work stronger where God is working. So Satan can use the ultra conservative or the huge churches, like, and
Yeah.
get people to doubt them, or people to be like, oh, this happens here, like, then I don't want anything to do with faith, then that's what Satan's going to use. And if he has to use men in power and control that we respect to do it, that's a good place for him to do it.
I think the part that really broke my heart the most is reading how a lot of the abuse happened in the church building and also in the house next door where you held a lot of Bible studies. Um, and even the first time that your dad allowed his friends to abuse you was right after your baptism. I mean, that just gutted me because I know what an emphasis the Churches of Christ place on baptism. I mean, they teach that that's the point that you're put into Christ. That's the point that you're saved and that your sins are washed away. And so I read that passage of how you were looking so forward to not feeling dirty anymore. And then to, you know, right afterward. So my husband and I interviewed a man named Jimmy Hinton. He's a preacher from Somerset, Pennsylvania, and his own dad was, he actually turned his dad in, and his dad is serving a life sentence for sexual abuse. But Jimmy also shared that a lot of the abuse took place in the room off the baptism pool. And so talk to us a little bit about what that did to your faith in God.
So, you kind of jumped right into the hard crap here.
Yeah. That was the hardest one for me. I had to put the book down for a little while after that.
I'm actually going to read this part that I wrote because it'll just come out a lot better. Yeah. So growing up, I was taught that if I was baptized, I was sinful and going to hell if I wasn't baptized. Because the abuse made me feel so dirty and bad. I wanted to be baptized because I couldn't imagine living through any more hell than I was already living through. I think part of me thought that if I was baptized, that God would save me from the abuse as well. When my dad allowed his friend to abuse me right after my baptism, I lost all my faith and everything. I desperately wanted to be saved from my sin and whatever was wrong with me that made people hurt me. And now someone else was hurting me and my father was watching. My baptism at 12 years old was influenced by fear and desperation and met with more abuse. It's normal for a young girl to view God the same way she views her father or the male figures in her life. And if God was anything like that, or like my father I experienced, I wanted nothing more to do with him. It wasn't just that day that abuse tainted my view of God and church for me. For many years and still sometimes to this day, so many normal church things are triggers for me, taking my mind back to things that happened to me as a child. The sound of communion trays clanging and songs take me back to terrifying times in my life. Scriptures was twisted and used to control me and keep me in line. I've had to do a lot of studying and relearning what the Bible says for truth. It is and the twisted, controlling lies I was taught. It wasn't until I was older and had a real understanding of God that I was able to see the church and what I was taught as a child was spiritual abuse and brainwashing. It took years for me to realize that God is really nothing like the image I had of him as a kid. I think one of the things that had the biggest impact on my view of God was meeting people that modeled the love of God and truly were his hands and feet. It's still crazy for me to think that Satan used people to hurt me, but God used people to heal me.
One of the things that struck me when you were reading that section is that there's such a high percentage of abusers. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. There's such a high percentage of victims that fall away from God, and there's a scary high percentage that end their lives because of the sexual abuse, and we'll get into that later in the interview. And I think that's what really bothered my husband and I the most when we were dealing with it in our little congregation is knowing what it does to people's faith and knowing that they weren't doing anything about it.
But if you think about it, like that's why Satan uses it.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's his scheme. Like it's his plan. And for years,
Let's get people to be mad at
I
God.
wanted nothing to do with God. And I know of people that question if God, like, they've known my story for years and they're like, I just don't understand how you can still believe in God. But I'm like, well, why else are we here? Like, there's got to be a purpose for it. And if
Yeah.
God, like, God has proven to me his love over and over, and God, like, has made a purpose for my story if I can do stuff like this and just bring hope.
Yeah. When my husband and I were going through and dealing with the 2 different abuse cases with our congregation, one of the most frustrating things was that, and if people are not familiar with the Churches of Christ, they're all independent congregations. They're not connected at all. The Bible says that we need to have a plurality of elders, so there needs to be at least 2, and in some churches there's much more than 2, but there needs to be at least 2. But in a lot of these little churches, there is no elders, and it's just the men. And we experience these men's meetings that make all the decisions. So they're not, you mentioned, they're not accountable to anybody. And so one of the frustrations we had is we were like, okay, there's a problem here, and it wasn't being dealt with. And I remember very distinctly, I was being very careful who I talked to. And for a while, I didn't talk to anybody because I didn't want to be accused of gossiping. And I actually had one man that I highly respected tell me, you can't talk to other congregations because that would be gossip. And for a while, I believed him. And then I remember my husband and I were talking, and I'm like, gossiping is and trying to solve a problem are 2 completely different things. And so I found that they were using that to keep people quiet, which was very frustrating. So in chapter 2 of your book, you mentioned how your family moved from church to church a lot. And it seemed like, if your dad didn't like somebody or if he didn't like how they were doing things, you would just move to a different church. So tell us a little bit about that, and also kind of like, because you mentioned that your dad would be one way in public. He was very much loved, and then a totally different person at home. So you were seeing that what I call rank hypocrisy on display.
Yeah, so the church that my dad got saved in, we were there. I don't know how long we were actually there, or why we left. My dad got saved when I was probably 5 or 6, I would say. And then I don't know why we left. I know people that still go there, and I don't think they shun people, but we didn't associate with them anymore. So I'm thinking my dad shunned us from.
Was it a Church of Christ?
Yes. Yeah. But so I'm thinking my dad shunned us from them.
Yeah.
We went to another church just one town over, and we were there for a while, and that's where my dad met a lot of his friends. And they might have had an elder board there. I don't really know. I honestly don't really care. But then we left that church to go start this other church, and there was no elder board. There was no
just the men.
There was no district. It was just the men, and there was nothing. Like, if you have a problem, who are you going to go to? And I have sat through several meetings in that church of people that were getting shunned, and we weren't allowed to talk to them, and this person was getting divorced, so we weren't allowed to talk to them anymore. And it was just like,
so you remember all this, and you were pretty young.
And I would have been a young teen at that point. But yeah, there was no talk of grace. There was no talk of forgiveness. It was all very, just very rigid and very just all about roles.
Yeah.
And I was like, if this is what church is about, like, I don't want anything to do with it. Like, if there's no love, and it's all roles, and it's all abuse, and it's all like men just like my dad and his friends were the leaders of the church, and if they didn't like somebody, they would shun them, like it's, yeah.
Wow. So in chapter 9 of your book, you talk about, like, you had, up until that point, you had talked a lot about the different abuses that were happening, physical and sexual, and you talk about finally confiding your secret in a lady where you had gotten your first job. Tell us about that a little bit.
So if you can kind of picture my life, it's kind of like the Duggars, or a lot of times I will refer to it as like the Mormon church out in Utah. Like I was this very protective, very sheltered young girl. And at 14, there was a greenhouse down the road from us, and I was allowed to get a job. And I was like, I finally got to experience freedom. But I'm sure I looked kind of similar to
Backwards.
the backwards, sheltered, like crazy. And like talking about the lingo, like I'm sure my lingo for stuff wasn't the same lingo that the outside world had. Like we didn't really go to family get-togethers. I would never was in sports. I did 4-H, but like it just still wasn't, I wasn't part of the world. So my bosses and the women there, like they picked up on stuff right away, pretty quick. Definitely they picked up on physical abuse. And then at one point my boss was talking to me about that, like the physical abuse, and then she brought up sexual abuse, and I tried to lie to her, but she could see right through it.
Good for her.
So yeah, so that was the start of my secret being exposed.
You mentioned, I think this was about the area of the bookend that you mentioned, worldly, and I remember that word is drilled into my mind again, even though we only spent 2.5 years. I remember they would refer to people outside the church as worldly. I understand, the Bible talks about there's people that are of the world, but it was just strange. They truly did not. And looking back, there was plenty of red flags that I ignored, but they truly don't associate with anybody outside of the Church of Christ.
They don't, and they would tell me things like my dad, when he would be abusing me, would tell me things like, oh, if you tell anybody, they'll get children's services and you'll be taken from us, and then you'll be part of the world. And I was like,
Yeah.
I don't look at all these other people that are part of the world, and are they living the same way that we're living? Like, I don't know. It was just, but yeah, you weren't allowed to associate with worldly people.
Wow. And I've heard that a lot. So once your boss found out, it sounds like it was only a matter of time before the authorities got involved. Share with us a bit about what it was like living through this time, and a little bit about why you chose not to tell about your dad's friends, because they also had abused you during these years.
So yeah, so I told my boss on a Saturday, and I don't think, because I had grown up with it, like I don't think I had any clue the drasticness of how my life would change, or even like how wrong it was. Like it had been a normal thing. Like my great uncle abused me when I was really little, and he lived with us. Like it was like I was grown up. Like that's all that I knew. That was normal to me. So right after she told, that was a Saturday. On a Monday, I got told at work that they took me to the house and said, look, we've already contacted Children's Services. What your dad did was not okay. We're going to call your mom and have her come over here. So at this point, I was like, my mom knew, but she, like, what is she going to say? So when my mom got there, she wanted, like, they had told her they were going to Children's Services and that they needed her to go down. But she, like, our preacher had to go down with her. Like, she couldn't do anything without him.
Wow.
So, yeah, I remember sitting in the office of the social worker, and they were like, did anyone else do this to you? And I was like, no. And I'm like, looking back, I'm like, I should have said, but I don't, like, it was, I didn't know what was going to happen. Like,
Yeah.
everything that my dad said, like, oh, they're going to go to Children's Services and you're going to go, like, I was scared to death. My dad had always said that he was going to kill us if we ever told. So there was that in the back of my mind. And then I'm like, well, like, maybe if my dad's not around, these guys won't be mean. Like, I don't, like, it, I really don't know why I didn't tell. Like, that's probably my biggest regret of my whole life.
Yeah.
But I can't go back and change it now. So
Yeah.
I've just had to work through that a lot.
You mentioned that your dad, and if I remember correctly, there was several places in your book that you mentioned that your dad threatened to kill you if you told. And there was even one time, I think closer to the time that everything came out, that he had actually pointed a gun at you.
There's a gun involved, yeah.
Wow, unbelievable. The book mentions that you had to testify against your dad twice because there was a mistrial declared. Um, so walk us through what it was like to find out that you had to do this all over again.
So honestly, like there were two trials, and they're kind of fuzzy to me. The first trial was declared a mistrial because one of the jurors had looked up information and brought it into the jury room. So they declared it a mistrial. And I remember I was with a couple of my teachers when that happened, and I was like, I don't even know what a mistrial means. Like, what does it mean? And later that afternoon, I had to meet with the detective and the prosecutor, and they looked at me and they're like, will you testify again? And I'm like, do I have a choice? Like, I don't want to go back to where I was. But so yeah, during the trials, I don't remember much about them. I had to point my dad out and describe him in both trials. And that was hard. My dad had this, like, which I don't know that I talk about this in my book, but he always had this grin on his face. And like when I had to look at him, he had that same grin, and it's just like that's forever in my brain. Like, but anyway, that's besides the point. But
It's like a power smirk.
Yes, very much a power smirk.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm just like, what? Like, you're sitting here going to prison and you have this smirk or grin or whatever.
Wow.
But at both trials, his whole church sat in back of him. They all supported him. The court system did a good job of protecting me from them at the courthouse. It was during that time. But the preacher's wife testified for my dad, and a girl that I considered to be my best friend testified for my dad during the trials. So, yeah.
Wow.
They definitely stood up for him. He pled the fifth, so he never had to say anything at either trial. We also weren't allowed to talk about any of the physical abuse. Something that his lawyer passed, we weren't allowed to. So I might have been coached to say certain things, and then they would, I don't know, his lawyer would say whatever, and they would, but the detectives, like, if you say it, it's in the jurors' minds. They can't write it down and take it to the deliberating room, but it's in their minds. So.
Yeah. I've learned a little bit about how the court process, the legal process works, and it can be very frustrating, especially on the victim side.
Then at the end, my dad was convicted in January of 2002, and he was sentenced to 15 years. So.
When was Ashley's Law passed?
In 2008.
Okay, so your dad was convicted 6 years before Ashley's. For some reason, I thought he was convicted just the year before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that passed in 2008, and he was convicted in 2002.
So your dad had to register as a tier 3 sex offender, which in current days would require him to be on the sex registry for life, but he only had to spend 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned in several places in your book how your dad was so good at fooling people, and it just brought to my memory because you mentioned that at court, everyone from church sat on his side. So he obviously had everybody from church fooled. Whether they were actually fooled or whether they actually knew, it's hard to say. Talk for a moment about, do you think your dad had everyone fooled?
I think he probably did. I think he had everyone in the community fooled. He had a great job. He knew he had a job in the community not very far from our house that he got to meet lots of the farmers, and a lot of them like would say, yeah, like he was this great guy. Like he when he went to prison, he had a great job with state benefits. Like he had worked himself up the ranks, and to meet him, like he seemed great.
Yeah.
Like
probably to this day.
Probably. Yeah. But nobody really knew what went on in our house or what methods of discipline that he used or like just the monster that he was.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of victims say that, especially when you're talking about abusive dads, that now it sounds like your dad did have a couple close friends, but a lot of these men really don't have friends. So they don't really ever have anybody come to the house to see what's going on. Um,
Our only friends were people from the church and people
Yeah.
that were a lot like him. Like I've described it as like living on an island and you're only going to let the people just like you that think like you and act like you on it, and that's what it was like.
yeah, it's so true. So after your dad was sentenced to prison, it sounds like you moved from place to place. I know you mentioned that you tried staying with your mom for a while and that situation was very toxic. And then you mentioned that you went to stay at a group home. And I think just the name group home has a negative connotation, but you described it as actually a very positive thing,
Yeah, the group home
or
was,
ended up being positive.
it ended up being positive. So my relationship with my mom was explosive. My mom blamed me for her life being messed up and for her family getting messed up and her having to go back to work, and it was just a big mess. Um, and at one point, I stayed with family members and my boss from the greenhouse, and then at one point I had to go to the hospital for suicide ideation. And when I left the hospital, they were like, "You have to go to the group home," and I'm like, "What the heck am I getting into?" Um, I was a sheltered girl. Like
hmm
I did not know anything. And I moved into the group home that was actually in the same town like my dad's court was held in. So I knew the town, and I was in just this little house with, it actually wasn't a house, it was a building, but with a boys wing and a girls wing. And it ended up being a really good safe place for me. Like I was at that point taking college classes and I had a job, and they let me basically keep living my life there. But yeah, the group home, my eyes were open, but yet to my eyes were open to what
was out there.
was out there. You'll have to read my book to hear
Yeah.
the funny stories.
I won't
about it.
give away the stories.
Um, but yeah, it ended up being a very safe place for me. And a lot of group homes, like people wouldn't say that, but that ended up being a really good
And
place
you,
for me.
if I remember correctly, you have actually went back since and volunteered at group homes, right?
I actually worked at a group home in a bigger town,
Okay.
and yeah, that was my favorite job ever.
Yeah, that's awesome. So in chapter 23, you talk about meeting the man who is now your husband. And you talked about how you were afraid that when he found out about you, that he wouldn't want you.
That was a huge fear of mine. I had dated guys, I looked for love, like they were all crappy guys that were not stable, and I mean, but I think that's what abuse does to us. Like I wanted to feel loved, and I knew I could feel love in the arms of a man. Like I wanted to be close to somebody, I wanted to be held, and I had knew that I could use my body to get that. But then this country boy asked me out at the fair, and honestly, Isaac knows, so it doesn't matter. But I wasn't going to go out with him because I was like, he's way too good for me. But my brother, who was living with me at the time, said, he has a nice truck. You have to go out with him. So
Your brother had his priorities straight.
yes, he did. So I went out with him, and I knew that he was a good Christian boy and he wasn't going to date somebody that didn't go to church. And at this point, it had been 3 years since my dad went to prison. Like it was just, I had wanted nothing to do with church or God or any of that.
Yeah.
So he asked me several times and I kept saying no. And then finally I'm like, this kid's going to break up with me if I don't go to church with him. So I ended up going to church with him once, and I was like watching everybody and everything. And I'm like, who's going in the back rooms? Like, what is being said, but it was way different than the church I grew up in. And like, they talked about a relationship with God, and they talked about love and grace and forgiveness. And I was like, this isn't the normal. This isn't the normal. So I ended up going to church with them every week. And yeah.
It sounds like the church circles, because you mentioned that the churches you went to, there was a piano, so they were open to instruments, at least at some level. I know the circles we come from, there was what they call the hard line, no instruments, no kitchens or anything. So, and again, I know you were a teenager when you left the Churches of Christ. Do you remember being taught that you were that only people in the Churches of Christ were Christians and everyone outside? Okay, so that was taught to you.
That was very much taught.
So that was brought up to us from the beginning, but I don't think we took it seriously. I mean, they did say that they were the one true church, and but again, I don't think I realized how much they believed that until we left and everyone cut us off. So you described going to church. What's your husband's name again? Isaac. Had you been told that all of these people were
yes,
not Christians?
that they were not Christians and they were going to hell. And
Yeah.
I was raised to believe that it was our job to evangelize them
Yes.
and tell them that they're going to hell. And now that my book is out and I've had other conversations, like, I think as a kid I said really mean things to people.
Yeah.
And like, I don't remember it, but like, I've
Yeah.
heard that I was, because that's what I was taught.
So further on, you mentioned how you had, against the advice of others, that you had written your dad several letters and hoping that he would admit to at least some level of what he had done to you. And he never really has, it doesn't sound like. So what was it like reading those letters and reading his responses?
So yeah, everyone's like, don't write to your dad, like you're just gonna get disappointed. But I think God wires us to love our parents. God wires us to want that relationship. I am 20 years in, and I don't want the relationship with my dad.
Yeah.
But there's still a part of you that wants that. And I told everyone that I was writing a letter to my dad because I just wanted to get things off my chest and I didn't have any expectations. But I don't know that you can write a letter like
Without
that
expectation.
without expectations. So I wrote him a letter basically just speaking my piece. I wanted him to know that I was okay and that I was pressing on and that he didn't kill me and that type of stuff, which there's copies of the letters in my book. But the letter that I got back from him, all of the letters that I got back from him were cold. He never has taken any responsibility. He in one letter, he sent me the phone number of one of the guys that abused me, one of his friends, and said he was waiting on me to repent. He sent me letters about the prodigal son.
Wow.
And one of the guy's wives, he sent me her phone number because she was willing to talk to me. So he admitted to physical abuse in the letters, but never anything other than that. And it left me very broken. I think you can say you send them without expectations, but you always have.
I don't know if you really can.
I don't know that you can, and it's just, though they sent me into a major tailspin.
You mentioned at one point, and I may be remembering wrong, but I thought that one of the later letters, it sounded like he admitted to some stuff, and you thought that it was because he was trying to look good to get early release.
So I got a letter, I think it's dated 2010. Might have been 2011. I think it was 2010. And he admitted and apologized for physical abuse and name calling and basically the belittling that he did. But and then less than 2 years later is when he filed for judicial release. And I'm like, that was definitely
planned
letter, a plan. So like that was part of his counseling or whatever he got in prison.
Wow.
So he also got college degrees and learned Spanish in prison. So I'm like,
So they paid for his college.
Maybe we all need to go to prison to get some free
Wow.
degrees.
So you mentioned that there was 2 of your dad's friends that abused you over the years, and that at least
Actually,
3 of them,
Mhm.
and at least one, possibly 2 of them, stopped by a house where you and Isaac were living and threatened you if you told anybody. Talk for a moment about how you did try at one point to sound the alarm on at least one of them, and what happened with that.
So up until this point, I hadn't told anybody about them. Like I was just still living with the secret, which was eating me alive. But I'm like, how do you end up saying it? I went into a major tailspin mentally, and I ended up telling about them. At that point, I had found I'm really good at Facebook creeping.
Mm-hmm.
And I had found that one of them had adopted kids. His kids were graduating and not going to be in the house, and he adopted kids. And at that point, that was a really dark place for me because I was like
Afraid for those kids.
I was afraid for those kids, and I was like beating myself up because if I would have said something about them, then he wouldn't have been able to get more kids to hurt. And it was, so that's them actually threatening me, I think, was because they were going through the adoption process and people were trying to dig up stuff on them. So I don't know if that's what that was all about. But that ended up leading me to tell.
One of the things that you and I talked about is our mutual frustration with the legal system. And one of the things that I remember actually came out in our very first phone conversation was the fact that your dad only had to spend 10 years on the registry after all of these awful things he did to you. On a personal level, and this is common knowledge, like you can find this out in any psychologist, anyone who works in a sex trafficking organization will tell you that pedophiles, specifically men who abuse minors, there's a very low chance of them ever actually changing. And so I think the biggest frustration for me, and this is a very commonly known statistic, on average, there's one pedophile, and I'm talking registered pedophile in every church congregation, in every church in the U.S. That's an average. Some churches may not have any, some might have 4 or 5. So I think that was just, and that information came out when we were digging into the other interview with Jimmy Hinton. So knowing that pedophiles are rarely truly repentant, and I'm actually going to edit in here an excerpt from the Jimmy Hinton interview where he actually talks about what a truly repentant pedophile looks like.
And you have to realize too the difference between repentance and remorse. And there's a guy by the name of Patrick Parkinson. He's an attorney in Australia who wrote a really good book on child sexual abuse, and I don't even think it's available anymore. I think it's out of print. And it was such a phenomenal book, but it never really gained traction. But he had a line in that, and he said, remorse is what happens in the back of a police car when somebody breaks down and they cry and they're so sorry for what they did. Repentance is when you try to make amends and right all of the wrongs that you did to every single one of your victims. And then he gives this list. And he said that begins with, from prison, from the minute you step foot in prison. That means you're going to find funds to the best of your ability to pay for counseling for every single one of your victims. And that means if you have any property, if you have a home, if you have any of that stuff, you need to sell it and you need to start paying for counseling for your victims. That's number one. Number two, you need to, so to speak, gouge your eyes out and never, ever put yourself in a situation where you're going to think about children, or you're going to think about it because they just do, but where you have access to children. That means when you got out of prison, You're not going to have internet. I mean, you're going to basically become Amish. You're not going to have internet. You're not going to have a smartphone. You're not going to have a computer. You're not going to have a camera that you can go around and take pictures of kids with. You're not going to do it. Why? Because you've proved over and over and over and over again that you can't be trusted with those devices. You're going to be transparent. You're going to tell everybody, this is what I did. These are the victims that I have. And I'm going to tell you about all the victims that I didn't get convicted on, that I produced. You're going to be very transparent. You're going to tell not only church leaders, you're going to tell everybody.
Yeah.
And so the frustration is that these churches aren't telling parents. And I know there's some legal boundaries, which just frustrates me to no end, but with somebody who has fallen off the registry, as I understand it, a church has every right to inform the congregation privately that there is a registered or even non-registered sex offender in their midst, but most times they don't. So talk for a minute about just some of the the frustrations with the legal system that you've experienced.
So, my dad filed for judicial release in 2012. I had just brought a baby home from the hospital, and I'm like, I thought he had 15 years, and the judge, who was amazing, he was the same judge that was the judge over my dad's trial.
Wow.
And he had built a relationship with me. Him and his wife would take me out of the group home on Friday nights to take me to dinner, which I'm like, you don't find that everywhere.
Yeah.
Like, he had built this relationship. So I called him as soon as I got the letter, and he's like, well, like, your dad can file for this every 6 months. And I'm like, I just brought a baby home from the hospital, my second kid. Like, I'm not ready for this. So he warned me, like, he could file 6 months later. And I'm like, I thought he's had 15 years. And he's like, well, if he's been good and, like, done everything, then he can get out. And so he denied him the first time, and he ended up getting out the second time. And they told me, the judge said, because I am still judge, I will give you a 2-year
Like restraining order or something.
restraining order for two years. And he's never tried to contact me. At that point, and even when I wrote my book, I thought he was on the registry forever. So I thought it was before. I found out after I talked to you, but maybe it was before.
Maybe.
I don't know.
It sticks in my mind from somewhere.
It had that was a really rough time, because I thought he was on the registry, and not that I looked at it all the time, but I looked at it some.
Yeah.
I wanted to know what cars he was driving and where he worked, and I went to look at it, and he wasn't there, and I'm like, what the heck? Like, what is going on? At this point, I could release my book at any point.
Yeah.
And I'm like, he's not even on the registry anymore. So come to find out, because my dad was sentenced before the law came into effect, like, he got to fall off the registry. And that was super hard for me, because I'm like, people can't just look him up and see. Like, so I worry about other people. But then I had to come to grips with, like, him being on the registry doesn't affect my everyday life. Like,
Yeah.
it was a form of justice to me, because I'm living with these scars forever, and, like, he was going to be on the registry forever. So, like, that took a long time to process.
Yeah.
But so I'm frustrated that, like, nobody can be protected from him, but at the same time, like, that's why we just have to be diligent as parents and who we let in our kids' lives.
I remember a conversation I had with because going through the process that my husband and I were going through, we had people come to us with stories about not necessarily registered sex offenders, but men who had done these very inappropriate acts with minors.
So many times it doesn't get reported.
Yeah.
So many times.
And so we had these stories told to us, and I was just becoming more and more frustrated with, why isn't anybody saying anything? And so when the situation with your dad came up, and I found out he was at another congregation and the men had made a decision not to tell the congregation, I spoke to an attorney, and the conversation, I remember, really blindsided me, because the attorney said to me, "Where's the grace for this man who has done his time?" But knowing what I know about pedophiles, they're not they're typically not repentant. And so, have you encountered any of that, and have you been advised legally, like what you can say, where to be careful? Because I know that's something that I was trying to be. I didn't want to be accused of slander, so I wanted to proceed carefully.
I haven't. I try not to go down that rabbit trail because I don't want to be an angry, bitter person. So
Yeah.
I'm like, if I can use my story to show hope,
Yeah.
and to make people aware so that they are watching. I try not to go on the perpetrator side very
Yeah.
much, because that's when I feel like I'm not using my story for good, and I'm not sharing light. I'm like not adding darkness, because you're trying to expose it, but I just
Can't stay there.
that gets me angry and bitter, and
Yeah.
I don't want to be
Yeah, I totally
an
understand.
old angry bitter person.
I understand. So you mentioned that throughout all of these years, you were never really allowed to have emotions when you were younger, that you had suppressed them and brushed them aside. And you talk about how here you are, fast forward many years, you're happily married, you have 3 beautiful kids, but you describe how you were just a mess in your mind and just dying inside.
Yeah, so because like growing up, I wasn't allowed to cry. We weren't allowed to talk about emotions. I think I've cried once since my book came out, and I was just like completely overwhelmed with life.
Yeah.
But I'm not an emotional person, but I am. Because I'd never been able to express emotions or let myself feel, I didn't know what to do with them.
Yeah.
So I bottled them all up, and then I resorted to bad coping skills. But I still those coping skills weren't helping me. Like, they were just making it worse. And I hit rock bottom, and suicide is like a taboo subject, but so many people deal with mental health, and I think the church really sucks, if I can say that.
They do.
At dealing with it. And so I was dark, I was depressed, and it didn't make any sense to me, because I'm like, I have this beautiful family, like I'm a successful person, like I have no reason to not be happy. Like, honestly, like God has put great people in my life, like the voids are filled, like it's okay. But yeah, I didn't know how to process everything. And so I had been in counseling for a long time. Like, it was court mandated when I first told about my dad, but I was freaking 15 years old. Like, I had no clue what even to process. And I hadn't even told it all yet. So it wasn't even like, this was where I can start and I can talk about all of this. And I was in survival mode. Like, a lot of times I didn't even know where I was living or where I was going to go that night.
You had probably been in like fight or flight for so many years.
For a long time. And I hit rock bottom really hard, and I had been going to a counselor, but I was just like not working. I ended up going to the hospital for suicide at one point. And I think, like a lot of people say, kind of like the group home, that was a bad experience for them. Like, the hospital was a really good experience for me. It gave me a time to reset, and I felt like I felt like I shouldn't feel bad. Like, I shouldn't be where I am. But then I was in the hospital, and like groups were there, and like there was a guy that was like over the Cleveland Clinic nursing staff, and I'm like, he has a good life too.
That was in the hospital.
That was in the hospital, and I was like, it's not just broken I mean, it's broken people because we're all broken people, but it's not just, I don't know, like everybody can be in the hospital
I
and
know
struggle.
one of the things that resonated with me when I read this portion of your book, because my husband and I were basically inundated with these abuse situations, and we finally got away from it and moved to a different congregation where things were actually good. And things were always good at this one congregation. And so I remember I battled because I had left the stress behind, and then I started sinking into the pit of depression. And you're right, it's confusing because you're like, why now?
Why now? Like, why? Like,
When I was going through it, I was fine, but
yeah. And I've always been really good about hiding what's going on in my head, and like
Yeah.
to finally admit to somebody, like, look, like, so I have my CCW, and I was like, I really don't think I should have my gun anymore. And they're like, what's going on? And I'm like, I'm not okay. Like,
yeah.
just finally being able to admit that was like huge. Like, there's a lot of stuff I still need to process. There's a lot of emotions I still need to feel, and yeah.
And you mentioned somewhere, whether it be in your book or a personal conversation, but you had mentioned that suicide, a lot of people think suicide is about wanting to die, and it's not that, it's about wanting the pain to stop.
Yeah, like for me, like I didn't want to leave my kids. Like I
Yeah.
want to see my kids grow up. Like I want to see like where God takes me in life, but it's like the everyday fight with your mind of like,
Yeah.
I don't want to feel this anymore. Like I don't want, like, for me, I describe it as a heaviness. Like it's just so heavy.
Yeah.
And like the Christian church will be like, "Oh, just give it to God." And I'm like, "No, it's not. It's not about just, I mean, like, not that you can't do that, but it's just harder than that. It just gets heavy to carry."
And as now my husband and I's situation is starkly different than yours, but I think everyone has their stuff in life. Our particular situation that's been heavy has been our daughter. She's going to be 17, and we had people, of course, we were involved in the whole It's Always God's Will to Heal movement for a long time, and that really messed us up because we were thinking, like, what are we doing wrong that our daughter's not being healed? Because people say that God wants to heal everybody. And so I remember that when people would say just give it to God, it was a similar thing. And I I have come to a peace, and I did a long time ago, that um, I was never mad at God for Ava's disability, but people around me would like get frustrated because I wasn't mad. God doesn't always take away our pain. I think he just I know he puts people in our life and he gives us the tools to get through, but he doesn't always take it away. Sometimes he does.
Sometimes, but I think I had a friend ask me years ago, if God heals you, what will your faith look like?
Yeah.
And I've thought about that several times, and I'm like, not that I think God could heal me, but also, would I be as empathetic, and would I be as caring, and would I be as passionate about my book and my story and showing hope to others
Yeah.
if I didn't still struggle with it every once in a while? Like it keeps me relying on God and being able to have these hard conversations, because if God did heal me, would I be prideful? Would I be? So I think God can still work in us whether we're healed or not.
I actually had very similar thoughts before my daughter was born. I had a kind of a big job with marketing in Toyota, and I was probably prideful. And I think back, if nothing else comes out of her situation, it has forced us to stay humble and forced us to rely on God. So yeah, I totally agree that situations keep us close to God, even through our pain. Going into the last part of the interview here, I'd like you to address two areas. Number one, what are the things that helped you the most when it came to dealing with suicidal thoughts and ultimately got you on the path of healing?
So I think like allowing myself not to be okay. That was huge, because I wanted to look like I had it together. I wanted to look like I didn't want to talk about my past because I didn't want people to know because I was still shameful of it.
Yeah.
So I'm like, oh, if I just look like I have it all okay, like I have it all together, then that's showing like the guys that they didn't win, the guys that hurt me that they didn't win. But finally just being able to admit like I'm not okay and I need help was a huge thing. And then like for me, going to the hospital was a good thing. I've also found it's kind of expensive to go to the hospital. So I've also found that like for me, just getting away and resetting my mind, like
Yeah.
I own a business, I have 3 kids, I volunteer a lot,
Yeah.
and just being able to go away and reset my mind has been a huge help. A lot of times what gets me down is I've had a trigger or a memory come up or I've seen somebody or something, and I've found that I have to process that. Like I have to sit with somebody and talk about the hard stuff, which is freaking crappy. I hate it. But shame dies when stories are told in safe places. And like I found that to be so true. Like that can have so much power over me, but when it's spoken in a safe place, it lets a little bit of light into that dark, dark time. And so like that has been a huge help for me.
And you mentioned a lot of it was just, you may have touched on it, but just having somebody to talk to, even if you have to tell them the same story 100 times. Yeah.
Just having somebody that cares. One big thing that I am super passionate about is staying connected. Like it is so, I call it don't be an EMT friend. Like it's so hard for me to text somebody that I haven't talked to in 2 months and be like, hey, I am really struggling. Like I need you. But if you talk to me every day or once a week, like it's just easier to have those conversations. Like this sucks. Like
Yeah.
I'm currently not on any medication. I've been on medication before. I just don't like the way it makes me feel.
Yeah.
But if I get really bad, then I will go on meds for a while. There's been times when I think that's the only thing that's got me through.
And I think there's such a stigma too that needs to go away is over meds. Of course, we need to be careful but there's a time and a place for it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
like if people have cancer or a broken bone or whatever, like they take medicine. Like it's no different. And if you study the mind and what trauma does to the mind, like it doesn't fire the same way. It doesn't. So
it alters.
So if you need medication to help it reroute those connector things, like then that's what you need. Yeah.
And so the last thing here is you talk about how music speaks to your soul.
I do. I love music the whole way down. I just got to. And I think for me, a lot of times it just gives me words for when I don't have words. Or there's been times when I'll find a song that I'm like, hey, like, this is how I feel, but I don't, like, so I can send it to a friend and be like, this is what I'm dealing with right now. So, yeah.
Music has always affected me on a deep level. I can definitely relate to that. The second part here is, what are some things that you would like to tell the support people out there that may be supporting someone who is dealing with depression and suicidal thoughts?
So I think it's such a taboo subject because people don't know what to do with it. Like they're afraid because they don't know. And I'm like, why would you treat somebody that's struggling with mental health any different than you treat them that's struggling with physical health?
Yeah.
Like it's the same thing. It's just
different approach.
Yeah, a different approach. And in my book, I try to explain like what helped me and what doesn't help. There's a lot of Christianese answers that are like, oh, I'll pray for you. Well, like that's good, but like for me, presence is a huge thing. Like, just even if you don't say anything, just be a presence in my life. Know what's going on. Robin Williams actually describes suicide as the urge to sneeze. And That sounds really
That's
weird.
crazy.
It sounds really weird, but it's kind of like when the battle is so hard and it seems so dark, like you just want out.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, I think he also described it as like jumping out of a window. Like you want to escape the pain that's at the fire that's in the house, but yet you know you're going to die, but you don't want to continue to live with that. And I think if people understood what it feels like, that maybe like you don't need to say the perfect thing. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to be a presence sometimes.
Yeah. And there's a whole section in the back of your book that I won't give away, but you go over so many different scenarios and so many different sayings that I thought was really a good help for someone dealing with that.
So like in my book at the very end, I go over what I need from my people when I'm fighting the urge to sneeze, and like don't give me space. Get me out of my element. Don't just tell me just to get over it, and don't make me a project. Make the appointment for me. Just that different types of stuff. I also think people view suicide as selfish, and if you know the lies that Satan and your brain is feeding you when you're feeling suicidal, you're not feeling selfish. Like your brain is telling you, no, like you're too much of a problem. You're weighing people down. You're going to abuse your kids the same way your dad and mom did you. Like your brain is not functioning the right way. Like it's not clear. And so you don't, like the people that don't get it think it's selfish, but I'm like, no, like if I hear somebody dying by suicide, it's more like they couldn't fight anymore.
Yeah. Chelsea, what was the intent of your heart when you decided to write this book, and what message would you like people to know?
So my heart behind my book was I want people to understand trauma. I think we live in an area where everybody thinks, oh, like I just live in this great little town. This crap doesn't happen here. And no, it does. Like it happens everywhere. I want people just to open their eyes and see like this is happening. These are ways I can prevent it. These are signs I can look for. But then I also want them to understand what trauma does. Like it almost killed me many times, and it's destroyed my family.
It physically killed you?
Like it's yes, like it's almost physically killed me several times. It's destroyed my family. It's just there's so many elements to it, and I think we've just gotten really good at living with our head in the sand, and we don't understand it, and so we avoid it and ignore it, when in essence that only adds to the shame of the victims. Like if you don't talk about it, like people don't talk about it, and I'm like, no, like you not talking about it just adds to the shame. And I wanted to give people real tangible ways to help people, and I really want the church to use it, because the church holds hope. Like God is our hope. God is redeeming my story just by doing stuff like this.
Yeah.
And if the church doesn't know how to handle it or what to do or how to respond, like we're not the hospital that we're supposed to be. Like we have all of these people coming in that need hope.
Yeah.
But if we're not even willing to talk to them about what the darkness, like where are we shedding that light? So I think that's like a huge thing. If you've been through it, like my book is raw and real, and I sometimes think maybe I told too many details, but I also want you to know that like you're not alone. Like there is hope. Like I've been through hell and back, and I can still function usually. I like there's hope. Like you can still work through it and live a good life. But basically, I just want people to understand trauma, and yeah.
Through our research, one of the most shocking statistics that we came across was that in just dealing with victims of the court system, 35% of all sexual abuse victims originate from churches. And I thought that was horrible. And 30% 75% from elementary school. So, like, if you just take churches and elementary schools, they make up like 75% of all sexual abuse victims. And that was
which
just
are supposed to be safe places.
right. And that's what dawned on me is, and you talked about that you would like churches to use your experience, and I would love to see people speak up.
Mhm.
You know, not be quiet. What's the saying? See something, say something.
In your love I find peace that calms my fears. Jesus, you are